Have you ever just stopped and thought about how many rules shape your day?
Mm.
Seriously. From stopping at a red light, which is
Mm-hmm.
pretty basic, right?
Mm-hmm.
To signing complex contracts, maybe for your house, for a job. Law in our everyday lives,
Mm.
it feels pretty solid, non-negotiable.
Yeah, you generally know where you stand.
Exactly. It's usually made by some sovereign authority, like Parliament or Congress. It applies everywhere within the borders. And, if you break the rules,
Mm.
there are consequences, clear ones.
Right. There's an expectation of enforcement.
But now, let's just zoom way out. Think globally. What happens when there isn't one single power calling the shots? No world government, no world police to arrest a country.
Yeah, where's the global 9/11?
Right. So, okay, let's try and unpack this. How can we even have something called international law when you've got all these independent countries supposedly free to do whatever they want? It feels like a massive contradiction.
It really does, because we usually think of law as needing that compulsory element, that backing of force.
Definitely. Coercion, punishment, a system.
But here's where it gets really interesting, like you hinted at. When big powers decide to, say, use military force,
Mm-hmm.
they almost always try to justify it by pointing to international law. They frame their actions within it, even if, to outsiders it looks a bit like they're stretching the definitions.
Right, finding the legal loophole, maybe.
Or creating one.
Yeah.
And despite having no real central enforcement body, like a global cop on the beat,
Yeah.
compliance with international law is actually, well, shockingly high, sometimes even higher than compliance rates for domestic laws.
Wow. Okay, that is a paradox.
It's a fantastic way to frame it. And that's really our mission for this deep dive, to peel back those layers and tackle the really big questions like, is international law even real law in the way we normally think about it?
Right.
Where does it actually come from? And maybe the most puzzling part, why on earth do states, these powerful, often self-interested nations, bother obeying it if there's no obvious global authority breathing down their necks?
That's the million-dollar question.
Exactly. So we'll look at the definitions, trace its history, which is longer and maybe more complex than you'd think. We'll get into where it draws its authority from, its sources, and then really unpack the reasons why states comply, even without traditional enforcement.
Okay.
And we're also going to explore how international law is changing, like fundamentally. There's this really significant shift happening, kind of moving away from the classic idea of international law, which was mostly about states dealing with other states, towards something some people are now calling world law, or even supranational law. This newer idea puts more focus on individuals, and it's pulled international law right into tricky areas like setting humanitarian standards, including what we now call the laws of war.
Okay, so a lot to cover.
Definitely. Our aim here is basically to give you a shortcut, a way to get really well informed on this super important, often confusing part of global politics, hopefully with a few surprising facts and, maybe a little bit of humor along the way.
Sounds good. So let's start right at the foundation. What do we usually mean by law, in our own countries? And how does this international version measure up?
Okay.
Domestically, law has some pretty clear features, right? First, like we said, it's made by a sovereign authority, your government. And that means it applies universally across the whole society. It reflects the state's will, and it overrides any other rules within its borders.
Right. It's the top dog, legally speaking.
Exactly. Second, it's compulsory. You don't get to opt out of taxes or murder laws just because you disagree with them. There are real consequences, backed by a system courts, police, prisons, a whole apparatus of coercion and punishment.
There's a mechanism for making you comply or punishing you if you don't.
Third, domestic law is very public. It's written down, published, codified. We have formal processes for making laws, and the punishments are generally known in advance. The opposite of that is arbitrary rule, which we associate with tyranny, not law.
Yeah, predictability is key.
And fourth, maybe the deepest point, is that domestic law is usually seen as binding. Even if you think a specific law is unfair, there's a general sense it should be obeyed. It carries this normative weight, this moral claim, this idea of what's right for society.
Mm-hmm. A sense of legitimacy?
Now, international law, the law governing states and other international actors,
Yeah.
it diverges quite a bit from that model. We usually split into two main types.
Okay.
There's private international law that deals with international stuff involving individuals or companies. Think of a contract between a French company and a Brazilian one, or maybe custody issues when parents are from different countries. It's sometimes called conflict of laws, basically, which countries' rules apply when jurisdictions overlap.
Right, sorting out cross-border private matters.
But what we're really digging into today is public international law. This applies to states themselves, treating them almost like legal persons. It covers government-to-government relations, dealings with international organizations, and increasingly even interactions with non-state actors like NGOs or armed groups.
Got it, so state-level interactions.
Exactly. And the absolute core difference, the thing we keep coming back to, is that public international law operates without a global legislature making the laws and without a conventional central police force enforcing them.
Yeah.
It's law in a very different environment.
Indeed. And while the actual term international law really only caught on in the 19th century, the underlying idea that states need some kind of rules for interacting goes way, way back. You can find traces in ancient Rome even earlier.
Right.
But as a structured system and institution, its origins really crystallize in 16th and 17th century Europe. This was a time of huge upheaval, the birth of the modern state system out of the ashes of the Holy Roman Empire, and you see a series of crucial treaties emerge that start laying down the ground rules.
Like foundational documents.
Pretty much. Think about the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Really important. It basically confirmed the independence of German principalities from the Holy Roman Emperor and, critically, let rulers choose the religion for their territory. A massive step towards sovereignty.
Okay, states deciding things for themselves.
Exactly. Then you have the really big one, the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. This wasn't just one treaty, but a whole set of agreements. It fundamentally reshaped Europe's political order, really cementing the idea of state sovereignty. Monarchs got the recognized right to have armies, build forts, collect taxes within their own defined territories without outside meddling. That's often seen as the birth certificate of the modern state system.
Right, the Westphalian system, you hear that term.
Precisely. And then, further solidifying this, you get the Treaties of Utrecht in 1713. These linked sovereign power directly to fixed, specific territorial boundaries. So these historical moments were absolutely key in setting the stage for what became international law, a system built around independent sovereign states interacting.
Fascinating. And were there thinkers trying to make sense of all this as it happened?
Oh, absolutely. And one name towers above others, Hugo Grotius, a Dutch polymath jurist, philosopher, diplomat living from 1583 to 1645. His book, On the Law of War and Peace from 1625, was genuinely revolutionary.
Why so revolutionary?
Because he developed a secular basis for international law. Before Grotius, discussions about how states should behave were almost always tangled up with religion, with divine law. Grotius argued, quite radically for the time, that international law was grounded in human reason.
Ah, okay. Moving away from theology.
Exactly. He built this logical framework, including his famous theory of the just war. He laid out 4 conditions for a war to be considered just: self-defense, enforcing your rights, getting compensation for injury, or punishing a wrongdoer. What Grotius did was emphasize the common interests of this emerging international community. He really founded the idea of an international society, states that are independent, yes, but also linked by shared rules and values.
That makes sense. And building on that, it really brings us to a core philosophical debate about law itself, right? This tension between natural law and positive law.
Absolute fundamental.
Natural law, as I understand it, is the idea that law comes from, or should come from, a higher moral system. It exists kind of independently of human laws. Law has to align with ethics, whether derived from nature, reason, or God. Its purpose is basically to enforce morality.
Right. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages argued exactly that human laws have a moral foundation, accessible through reason, universal rights, and wrongs.
But then, starting maybe in the 19th century, positive law really took hold as a counter-argument. This view says law is simply, well, whatever commands are laid down and enforced by the authority in charge. It doesn't matter if it's morally good or bad.
Yeah, its roots are often traced to Thomas Hobbes and his pretty blunt command theory, basically. Law is the word of him that by right hath command. It developed into legal positivism. Law is law because the sovereign says so and makes people obey, full stop.
So what law could be completely unjust, but if it's properly enacted and enforced by the state, under positive law, it's still technically law.
That's the implication, yes. It separates law from morality.
But then, the 20th century happened, and we saw a huge, really crucial revival of natural law ideas. Why? Because people were horrified by how regimes like the Nazis and Stalinists used the appearance of legality their own positive laws to commit unbelievable atrocities.
Right. The cloak of legality.
Exactly. The Nuremberg and Tokyo trials after World War II really struggled with this. How do you prosecute people for acts that might have been legal under their own national laws at the time, but were clearly monstrous? They had to reach for something higher.
The higher standard.
They invoke natural law concepts, but crucially, they frame them in the modern language of human rights. The idea that there are fundamental moral lines that no state law can legitimately cross. This led to a massive expansion of international humanitarian law, the world saying some things are just wrong, period.
And that loop brings us right back to the core puzzle, the paradox of international law. We know it can't be enforced like domestic law, no world legislature, no world police. The closest things we have are the United Nations, set up in 1945, which has some theoretical supranational clout, and its main court, the International Court of Justice, ICJ, from 1946. But, and this is key, the ICJ has zero enforcement power on its own.
It can make rulings, but can't force compliance.
Precisely. The UN Security Council can impose sanctions, theoretically, but even it lacks an independent army or police force to ensure states actually comply, even though its decisions are supposed to be binding on all members.
So it's more about political pressure or collective action, not direct force.
Largely, yes. And this is why you often hear international law called soft law. It implies it's not strictly binding in the same way as domestic law, more like a set of strong moral or political guidelines. Hard law, by contrast, is what we have domestically enforceable rules, clear penalties.
Okay, soft versus hard.
So the paradox is, despite being mostly soft law and lacking conventional enforcement, compliance, as we said, is remarkably high. Even Grotius, centuries back, noted this, suggesting enforcement relied more on state solidarity and mutual interest than brute force.
But skeptics, especially realists, would still argue, right? If you can't force compliance, is it really law? Isn't it just nice ideas, moral guidelines?
That's the classic realist critique, absolutely. But the evidence, even acknowledged by realists like Morgenthau, shows centuries of surprising observance. So the paradox isn't just that states obey, but why they obey something that exists in this strange space between universal ideals and raw state power. That tension is what makes it so fascinating.
Okay, so if it is obeyed so often, despite the enforcement issues, where does it actually originate? What are the sources on international law? But you mentioned something important earlier before we list them. There's a critique we need to acknowledge.
Yes, absolutely. It's crucial context. The way international law developed, the concepts, the institutions we have today, they were overwhelmingly shaped and promoted by Western European great powers, particularly during the colonial era.
Ah, right. So it wasn't a globally inclusive process from the start.
Not at all. And this leaves the whole system open to the critique of being fundamentally Eurocentric. Scholars from post-colonial perspectives argue that it can, sometimes subtly, sometimes overtly, function to maintain historical power imbalances, allowing former colonial powers to exert influence, but now under this veil of seemingly neutral, universal law.
Giving power a patina of moral legitimacy, as you said earlier.
Exactly. It's a really important lens through which to view the sources we're about to discuss. It reminds us that law isn't always neutral. It carries history and power within it.
Okay, duly noted. So with that crucial context in mind, what are the official sources according to the ICJ's own rulebook?
Right. The Statute of the International Court of Justice lays out four main sources.
And the first you said is the most important.
By far. International conventions, which basically means treaties. A treaty is just a formal, written agreement between states where they promise to do certain things or not do certain things.
Like contracts between countries.
Essentially, yes. They can be bilateral just between two states, like arms control treaties between the U.S. and Russia. Or they can be multilateral, involving 3 or more states, like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, or the UN Charter itself.
Okay. And how are they different from domestic laws?
Well, the biggest difference is that treaties generally only bind the states that have actually agreed to them, the states that have signed and ratified the treaty. It's based on consent.
So if you don't sign, you're not bound.
Generally, yes. Though sometimes, if a treaty becomes incredibly widely accepted, like maybe the Genocide Convention, parts of it might be seen as reflecting customary law, binding even non-signatories. But the core principle is voluntary agreement.
And once you've agreed,
Then a fundamental principle kicks in. Pacta sunt servanda, Latin for agreements must be kept. It's the bedrock idea that states have to carry out their treaty obligations in good faith. Without that, the whole system collapses.
is there ever an escape clause?
There is a very rarely used, highly controversial one called Redus Stantibus, things standing thus. It basically means if the fundamental circumstances under which the treaty was signed have drastically, unforeseenly changed, a state might argue it's no longer bound. Think of it like, signing a peace treaty based on certain borders and then an earthquake completely redraws the map. It's a very high bar, though.
Right, not just because you change your mind.
Definitely not. And because treaties are based on consent and negotiation between sovereign states, they fit very neatly into that positive law tradition we talked about, law created by agreement, not higher morality.
Okay, so treaties are number one. What's number two?
The second most important source is international custom, or customary international law. This is fascinating because it's not written down in agreements. It emerges from the actual consistent practices of states over time, practices that they come to view as legally required.
So it's based on what countries do.
Yes, and crucially, why they do it. It requires two things: consistent state practice, and something lawyers call opinio juris, the belief that the practice is legally obligatory, not just convenient or habitual.
How is consent involved here?
It's different from treaties. Consent isn't explicit signing. It's inferred from a state's behavior. If a state consistently acts a certain way and doesn't object when others do too, it can be seen as consenting to the custom.
And this applies universally.
Often, yes. Customary law is frequently assumed to have universal jurisdiction, especially if it reflects deep-seated moral principles, linking it more closely to the natural law tradition. Think about diplomatic immunity. For centuries, states granted protections to diplomats based on reciprocity and expectation, long before it was written down in treaties.
What's the downside of custom?
Its main weakness is vagueness. When exactly does a practice become widespread and consistent enough? When does opinio juris solidify? It can be really hard to pinpoint. That's why there's been a trend to codify customs into treaties, like the Vienna Conventions on Diplomatic Relations, to make them clearer.
But does custom still have power?
Oh, absolutely. Especially when it reflects fundamental moral understandings. The prohibition against genocide, for example, is widely seen as a customary norm binding on everyone, regardless of whether they signed the 1948 Genocide Convention. It can be more powerful than a treaty in that sense.
Okay, so treaties and custom are the big two. What else?
The third source is general principles of law recognized by civilized nations. It's a bit more nebulous.
Civilized nations. That sounds a bit dated.
It definitely reflects the era it was written in, and it's quite controversial language now. But the idea is that it fills gaps. When there's no clear treaty or custom, the court can look to legal principles that are common across most major domestic legal systems. The implication is, if something is considered a crime almost everywhere internally, it should probably be considered wrong internationally too.
Like a basic standard of conduct.
Sort of. For example, arguing that aggression or invading territory violates these general principles, even if a specific treaty doesn't cover that exact situation. It's a fallback, less frequently used.
And the last one.
The fourth and least significant source: judicial decisions and the teachings of highly qualified legal scholars. The ICJ statute says these can be used as a subsidiary means for determining rules of law. They don't create law, but the writings and judgments of respected international lawyers and courts can help interpret treaties, clarify custom, or shed light on general principles when things are unclear.
So expert opinions and past rulings can help figure things out.
Exactly. They provide guidance and interpretation, especially on tricky points.
All right, so we have these sources, treaties, custom, general principles, scholarly work. But we keep hitting this wall. Enforcement. Come back to that paradox. If there's no world police, why the high compliance? You mentioned Morgenthau, the realist, being surprised by it.
Yes, even he acknowledged it. And look, let's be realistic. No legal system, even domestic ones with police and prisons, achieves 100% compliance. Crimes happen everywhere. The truly remarkable thing about international law isn't that it's sometimes broken, but that it's observed so often, despite the apparent lack of teeth. So, why? It's not one single reason, but a mix of motivations.
Okay, let's break those down. What are the key drivers for compliance?
Our sources point to about 5 main ones. First, and maybe the most straightforward, is plain old self-interest and reciprocity. Call it utilitarian compliance.
Makes sense. Do what's good for you in the long run.
Precisely. States often obey the law because they calculate it serves their long-term interests better than breaking it. And reciprocity is huge here. You follow the rules regarding my diplomats because you want me to follow the rules regarding yours.
Tit for tat, basically.
Exactly. Or think about trade rules under the World Trade Organization. States generally stick to agreed tariff levels because they benefit hugely when other countries do the same. It creates a stable, predictable system that benefits most players.
Okay, self-interest. What's next?
Second is a broader fear of disorder. International law provides the essential rules of the game. It creates common understandings, reduces uncertainty, makes state behavior more predictable. Without it, imagine the chaos.
Anarchy, basically.
Potentially, yes, and states fear that. They fear negative reciprocity where one small violation triggers a retaliation, which triggers another, spiraling downwards. Think of a minor border skirmish escalating into full-blown war. Defensive realists really emphasize this. States prioritize security, and a predictable, ordered world, even an imperfect one, is more secure than total chaos.
So maintaining the system itself is a motivation.
Absolutely. Third is the fear of isolation. Being seen as a law-abiding member of the international community is important. It builds reputation, enhances soft power, the ability to persuade rather than coerce, and makes other countries more willing to cooperate with you on trade, diplomacy, everything.
Like being the reliable partner.
Exactly. Look at the U.S. after the 2003 Iraq invasion. Facing widespread criticism for arguably breaching international law, it felt pressure to work within UN frameworks afterwards to gain legitimacy for its actions. States that constantly flout the rules risk becoming pariahs. Think of Libya under Gaddafi, decades of isolation due to terrorism, and WMDs eventually pushed them towards compliance. Nobody wants to be completely shut out.
Makes sense. You need partners. What's number 4?
Fourth, and maybe a bit surprisingly, given what we said about enforcement, is a genuine fear of punishment. Okay, no world police, but punishment can happen. States can retaliate individually or collectively.
How does that work legally?
International law recognizes the right of reprisal. If State A violates a law against State B might be legally justified in taking action against State A that would normally be illegal, as long as it's a proportionate response. Think economic sanctions or even military action in self-defense.
Like Article 51 of the UN Charter.
Self-defense. Precisely. That's a legal justification for force. And you can see collective punishment, too. The 1991 Gulf War, authorized by the UN to expel Iraq from Kuwait, was framed as a legally sanctioned punishment for aggression. So consequences can be very real, even without a central enforcer.
Okay, so self-interest, fear of disorder, fear of isolation, fear of punishment. What's the 5th one? Feels like something's missing, maybe something less cynical?
You're right. The 5th reason is identification with international norms, a kind of moral motivation. States, or rather the people making decisions within them, often comply with international law simply because they believe it's the right thing to do. It's seen as legitimate, morally binding.
Like how most people don't murder not just because they fear prison, but because they think murder is wrong.
Exactly the same principle. This applies especially strongly when international law reflects deeply held, widely shared values like the bans on slavery, aggression, or genocide. Liberals emphasize this aspect, seeing a moral dimension to international relations. Constructivists go further, arguing that international law actually helps shape what states perceive as right or in their interest over time.
So it's a mix of everything, practical calculations and ethical beliefs.
Absolutely. State behavior is driven by mixed motives. Self-interest, fear of consequences, desire for order, and genuine belief in the rules all get tangled together. It's complex, but it helps explain that high compliance rate.
Okay, that framework of motivations is really helpful. So given all this complexity, the weird enforcement, the mixed motives, how do different academic perspectives, different schools of thought actually view international law? We touched on realists and liberals.
Right, and understanding these different viewpoints is key because they reveal fundamentally different assumptions about how the world works or how it should work. International law isn't just a technical subject, it's deeply political and philosophical.
Let's start with the realists again. Skeptical is the word.
Deeply skeptical, generally. They draw that hard line between domestic law, real law, because there's a sovereign, and international law, not quite real law because there isn't. For many realists, it's more like a set of moral guidelines or ideals, not binding commands. Remember Hobbes? Where there is no common power, there is no law.
Morgenthau called it primitive law.
Exactly. Though most contemporary realists wouldn't dismiss it entirely, they see it playing a limited role, mainly reflecting the power and interests of states. Its primary purpose, from their view, is to manage interactions and uphold state sovereignty. They get very wary of any move towards supranational law that prioritizes global justice or individual rights over state rights and interests.
Okay, so realists, skeptical, state-centric, focused on power. What about liberals? Much more optimistic.
Generally, yes. Liberals tend to start from the belief that humans are rational, capable of cooperation, and possess inherent rights. They see the international sphere as having a moral dimension. Early 20th century idealists were hugely optimistic, believing in peace through law. They pushed for things like the League of Nations and the Kellogg-Briand Pact that tried to outlaw war.
A bit too optimistic, perhaps, in hindsight.
Perhaps, but the core belief persists. Modern liberals, sometimes called neoliberals in international relations theory, see international law as vital. They argue it reflects shared interests, facilitates cooperation, builds trust, and helps manage interdependence by translating agreements into clear rules. It makes cooperation easier and more reliable.
So for liberals, it's a positive force for progress and cooperation.
Definitely. Then you have constructivists. Their angle is really interesting. They focus on how norms, ideas, and identities shape the world. For them, international law isn't just a reflection of state interests. It actively constructs those interests and shapes state identities over time. Well, think about slavery or torture. These were once widely accepted practices. Constructivists argue that the development of international norms and laws against them gradually changed how states saw themselves and what they considered acceptable behavior. The law helped change the definition of normal.
So law shapes the actors, not just regulates them.
Precisely. And related to this, you have approaches like critical legal studies, CLS, often drawing on post-structuralism. They focus on the language of law itself, arguing it's often ambiguous, open to interpretation, and can mask underlying power relations. They're influenced by Marxist and feminist critiques, too.
Speaking of Marxist, what's their take? Also skeptical, but maybe for different reasons than realists.
Very skeptical, yes. But their critique is rooted in economics and class power. They tend to see international law not as a neutral framework for peace, but as part of the capitalist world system, ultimately serving the interests of dominant states and global capital.
So it reinforces inequality.
That's the argument. China Miéville, in his Marxist analysis, argues international law is actually complicit in global problems and fundamentally unreformable. He suggests its real force comes not from agreement, but from coercive political violence imperialism. It's a very sharp critique, seeing law as intertwined with power and exploitation.
Wow, okay. That's a strong stance. And feminist perspectives. You mentioned gender mainstreaming earlier.
Yes, feminist analyses bring another crucial lens. They point out how international law, historically developed mainly by men, often reflects male perspectives and priorities. The very definition of a legal person, or the focus on state security over human security, can embody patriarchal biases. Women's experiences, particularly during conflict, were often ignored or minimized.
Perpetuating stereotypes, like women only as victims.
Exactly. But feminist scholars and activists are also working within international law to change it. People like Christine Schinken have been hugely influential in pushing for gender mainstreaming, ensuring women's rights and perspectives are integrated. Think about those UN resolutions on women, peace, and security, and recognizing sexual violence as a war crime that's partly the result of decades of feminist advocacy.
So it's both a critique and an effort to reform.
Very much so. And finally, that post-colonial critique we mentioned earlier, it sees international law as deeply rooted in Western dominance and the colonial experience.
Tainted by its origins.
That's the core argument. Developed from European, often Christian thinking, used to justify colonial expansion, and its institutions, like the ICJ with Security Council influence, are seen as still reflecting the interests of the powerful, industrialized West. Anthony Anghie puts it starkly. Colonialism was central to making international law what it is. Concepts like sovereignty were forged in that unequal encounter. It challenges the whole idea of its universality.
Okay, so these different perspectives really show there's no single agreed-upon view of what international law is or does. It's contested territory.
Absolutely. And that brings us to how it's changing now. Because here's where things get, as I said, really interesting and maybe even more controversial. International law isn't static, it's evolving, and its scope and purpose are expanding dramatically.
You mentioned this shift from international to world or supranational law. Let's unpack that. What was the classical view?
Right. The classical view was totally state-centric. Law governed relations between sovereign states. Its main job was to keep order, manage disputes, maybe prevent war. Think of it as rules for a club of equals.
Sovereignty was king.
Absolutely, foundational principle. States related to each other horizontally. This view had four key features. One, only states were the real subjects of international law. The law recognized states existed, like via the Montevideo Convention criteria, government, territory, population, but didn't really deal with individuals or companies directly. Two, owner states were the agents they made the law. Treaties, custom, and enforced it. Self-help, diplomacy. Three, its purpose was narrow. Regulate state interactions, protect sovereignty, non-intervention was key. Four, its scope was limited to order, not justice. Human rights, environment, economic fairness, those were domestic issues. The ICJ really embodies this classical model.
So a law between nations, not above them.
Precisely. But that's being challenged by this emerging constitutionalist view, pushing towards world or supranational law. Thinkers like Habermas talk about the constitutionalization of international law.
What does that mean in practice?
It tries to create a more vertical relationship. International law isn't just agreements between states, but potentially a higher authority binding states, like a global constitution might bind its components. It's tied up with the whole idea of a global governance.
Now, how do we see this shift happening?
Four big ways. First, individuals and groups are now subjects of international law. Think human rights law, international criminal law. These apply directly to people, not just states. Second, non-state actors, especially NGOs, are agents. They lobby, they help draft treaties, they monitor compliance. The Rome Statute for the ICC is a prime example. NGOs were hugely involved.
So states aren't the only players anymore.
Not by a long shot. Third, the purpose is widened. It's not just about preventing war between states. International law now regulates what states do inside their own borders, trade policies via the WTO, environmental standards, human rights. Fourth, the scope now clearly includes global justice, setting minimum standards for how people are treated, protecting refugees, prosecuting international crimes. It's a massive expansion from just managing state-to-state relations.
That really is a profound transformation. Let's talk more about the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. You said it's more classical.
Yes, it primarily reflects that state-centric model. It's the UN's main judicial body, set up in 45, started work in 46. Its job is settling legal disputes between states and giving advisory opinions to UN bodies. 15 judges, elected for 9 years. The P5 members of the Security Council always have a judge, which is, well, a point of contention itself.
But it has had successes.
Oh, definitely. It's the biggest attempt to apply the rule of law globally between states. It's settled border disputes like the El Salvador-Honduras one that literally sparked a war, or the Cameroon-Nigeria dispute over territory. It helps clarify maritime boundaries, fishing rights. It does important work in preventing smaller conflicts from escalating.
But it has weaknesses, too.
Significant ones. First, as we said, only states can bring cases. Individuals, companies, NGOs are excluded. That's a big limitation for human rights or individual criminal matters. Second, and this is huge, it lacks compulsory jurisdiction and enforcement. States have to agree to be subject to its rulings, and only about a third have signed the clause doing so. States can pull out, like the U.S. did, and the court can't force compliance. It relies on states obeying or the Security Council stepping in, which basically never happens.
And the bias issue.
Historically, yes. Developing countries often felt it leaned towards Western interest, partly due to the Security Council's structure influencing judge selection. However, caseload has doubled since the Cold War, and you see cases like Gambia suing Myanmar over the Rohingya genocide, which shows smaller states using it to uphold principles, not just direct interests.
So it's evolving, but still faces core limitations. This really highlights that tension you mentioned, the old state-centric view versus this newer world law idea.
Exactly. Realists worry world law undermines sovereignty and risks disorder. Liberals and cosmopolitans are eager to inject ethics and global justice, seeing untamed sovereignty as the problem. Today's international law is a mixed sovereignty is still vital, but human rights and humanitarian norms are undeniably part of the landscape. Managing that tension is the ongoing challenge.
A perfect example of that tension must be humanitarian intervention, right? The idea of intervening in another country to stop atrocities.
Precisely. The UN Charter strongly prohibits intervention, Article 27. Yet you have the Genocide Convention, human rights treaties, affirming individual rights, which seems to clash with absolute non-intervention when horrors are unfolding. There's no clear treaty allowing unilateral humanitarian intervention, but some argue it's maybe becoming customary law. It's legally very murky and politically explosive.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly because this ties directly into how the rules around war itself have changed. This evolution towards international humanitarian law, IHL, Seems like a prime example of that move from international to world law.
Absolutely. It's one of the clearest illustrations. The sheer brutality of modern industrialized warfare in the 20th century forced a rethink of traditional just war theory, both when it's okay to go to war, jus ad bellum, and how you fight, jus in bello.
How did the rules on when to fight change?
The UN Charter in 1945 drastically narrowed the legitimate reasons for using force. Essentially, only two circumstances are now clearly legal. Self-defense if you're actually attacked, Article 51, which is seen as an inherent right, or if the UN Security Council authorizes force for peace enforcement, Article 42. That's it, a huge restriction compared to earlier history.
And the rules on how to fight, that's where war crimes come in.
Exactly. The idea of war crimes and individual accountability took center stage. Now, prosecuting wartime misconduct isn't new. You can find ancient examples. But modern thinking really took shape with the Hague Conferences, 1899-1907, which set rules limiting warfare's horrors, banning certain weapons, protecting POWs.
In Nuremberg after WWII,
Crucial. The Nuremberg Principles explicitly defined acts like murder or mistreatment of civilians and POWs as war crimes. Then came the 1949 Geneva Conventions, plus later protocols. They are the absolute cornerstone of modern IHL, providing incredibly detailed lists of specific war crimes: willful killing, torture, causing great suffering, taking hostages, unlawful deportation, wanton destruction of property, and so on.
and sexual violence was added later.
Yes, a landmark moment was UNSC Resolution 1820, 2008, formally recognizing that rape and other forms of sexual violence can constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity, or even acts of genocide, a vital recognition of gendered violence and conflict.
Beyond war crimes, there's this other category, crimes against humanity. How is that different?
It's a broader, hugely significant, and sometimes controversial category. The basic idea that some acts offend fundamental humanity goes back centuries, like in the anti-slavery movement. But as a distinct crime, it really emerged with the atrocities against Armenians during WWI, labeled crimes against humanity and civilization.
Nuremberg formalized it.
Yes, the 1945 Nuremberg Charter made a clear distinction between war crimes, linked to armed conflict, and crimes against humanity, which could potentially happen outside of war, though often linked. Since then, they generally have three characteristics: targeting civilians, being widespread or systematic, and being intentional.
And the Rome Statute for the ICC detailed them further.
Exactly. The 1998 Rome Statute gives the most detailed list: murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, torture, rape, sexual slavery, persecution, political, racial, religious, etc., apartheid, and other inhumane acts. Genocide, while technically a separate crime under its own 1948 convention, is obviously a crime against humanity in the general sense often called the crime of crimes.
What's the significance of this category?
Its huge value is establishing individual criminal responsibility for mass atrocities, even if they don't fit the technical definition of a war crime during an active conflict. It reflects that moral cosmopolitanism, the idea that all humans deserve protection, but critics do find the category potentially vague and question the universality of the moral principles it rests on.
It's fascinating how the end of the Cold War seemed to unlock the potential for actually prosecuting these crimes through international tribunals.
Absolutely. During the Cold War, U.S.-Soviet rivalry basically paralyzed the UN Security Council, preventing the creation of such courts. Prosecutions happened nationally, if at all. But once the Cold War ended, that political logjam broke.
Leading to the Yugoslav Tribunal.
Yes, the horrific reports from the Balkan Wars led the Security Council to establish the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTY, in 1993, based in The Hague. It was the first international war crimes court since Nuremberg, Tokyo, mandated to prosecute genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity from those conflicts.
And they prosecuted high-profile figures.
They did. Slobodan Milosevic, former Yugoslav president, was indicted, a landmark moment, the first head of state prosecuted by such a court. Though he died before his trial finished, others like Ratko Mladic were convicted. It showed leaders could be held accountable.
And then Rwanda.
Following the 1994 genocide, the Security Council created the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, ICTR, in Arusha, Tanzania. It investigated the genocide and famously saw the former Rwandan Prime Minister, Jean Kambanda, plead guilty to genocide, another first. These tribunals were hugely significant. They brought attention to mass atrocities, established individual culpability for leaders, and importantly, clarified that crimes against humanity could happen in internal conflicts or peacetime.
But they weren't perfect. You mentioned cost and inefficiency.
Exactly. These ad hoc, case-by-case tribunals proved incredibly expensive and slow. The ICTY and ICTR cost billions in trials dragged on for years. This inefficiency and cost, combined with the desire for a more consistent approach, really fueled the movement for a permanent court.
Which led to the International Criminal Court, ICC.
Precisely. The ICC was established by the Rome Statute in 1998, again heavily influenced by NGOs, and began operating in 2002. It's designed as a permanent court of last resort.
What does last resort mean?
It means the ICC only steps in when national courts are unwilling or genuinely unable to investigate and prosecute the most serious crimes themselves. Genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and potentially aggression, though that's complex. It's meant to complement national justice systems, not replace them.
And its relationship with the UN?
It's independent, not a UN organ like the ICJ, though it's also based in The Hague. The relationship with the UN Security Council was a major fight during negotiations. The U.S. wanted the Council, and thus the P5 veto, to control which cases went forward. That was rejected. The compromise was that the Council can pass a resolution to defer an investigation for 12 months, renewable. This stops a P5 veto being used to permanently block a case against its own citizens, but still gives the Council some influence.
But not everyone joined the ICC.
No, and that's a huge issue. While 120 states voted for the Rome Statute, key powers like the U.S., China, Russia, India, and Israel remain outside. This limits its reach and impacts its perceived legitimacy. Only the UK and France among the P5 have ratified. No nuclear powers outside Europe are members.
Let's focus on the USA and the ICC. It's been a consistently difficult relationship.
Extremely difficult. Clinton signed the statute but recommended against ratification. Bush then famously unsigned it and pursued those bilateral immunity agreements, BIAs, to protect Americans from ICC prosecution abroad.
Trying to create immunity zones.
Effectively, yes. Obama engaged more constructively but didn't rejoin. Trump was openly hostile, imposing sanctions on ICC personnel. Biden lifted the sanctions but maintained opposition to ICC investigations involving U.S. or Israeli personnel.
Why is U.S. non-participation such a big deal?
Because the U.S. is the world's dominant military power, active globally. Its absence creates a massive legitimacy gap. If the court is seen as only prosecuting Africans or citizens of weaker states, while the most powerful nation remains immune, its credibility suffers immensely. It also opens the U.S. to charges of hypocrisy, preaching a rules-based order, but opting out of this major accountability mechanism.
Especially when U.S. actions, like in Afghanistan or drone strikes, raise questions that critics say need independent investigation.
Exactly. Critics argue national investigations are often insufficient, highlighting the need for a body like the ICC. The contradiction became stark in 2022 when the U.S. supported ICC action against Russia in Ukraine while continuing to shield its own personnel from ICC scrutiny elsewhere. It's a deeply complex and politically charged situation.
It really is. So this brings us to the big debate. Is the ICC actually effective? Does it work? Or is it fundamentally flawed?
There are strong arguments on both sides.
What are the main points for its effectiveness?
Well, first, proponents argue it strengthens international humanitarian law by codifying norms from Nuremberg and providing clear definitions. It offers more coherence than ad hoc tribunals and is less subject to Security Council politics potentially blocking cases. Second, it aims to tackle the global justice gap, offering a potential avenue for justice when national systems fail victims of mass atrocities. Third, there's the hope of deterrence. The idea is that knowing the ICC exists might make leaders think twice before committing atrocities. High-profile trials act as warnings.
So, codification, justice for victims, deterrence. What about the arguments against its effectiveness or the criticisms?
Several major ones. First, the threat to sovereignty and national security. The fact it can potentially prosecute citizens of non-member states if crimes occur on member territory or via UN referral is a huge sticking point, especially for the U.S. with its global military presence. Second, some argue it has an unhelpful focus on individual guilt that might oversimplify complex conflicts and even hinder peace processes, like indicting a leader who might then refuse to negotiate.
Undermining peace for the sake of prosecution.
That's the concern raised by some critics. Third, and this is a powerful critique, is that it's a political tool of the West. Critics point to its Eurocentric legal roots, its funding and influence predominantly from European states, and the fact that until recently, all its indictments were against Africans. This fuels accusations of bias and neocolonialism, ignoring systemic problems in favor of prosecuting individuals from less powerful nations.
Wow. So the debate is fierce, touching on sovereignty, justice, peace, and global power dynamics.
It really is. The ICC embodies all those complex tensions inherent in modern international law.
Okay, we have covered an incredible amount of ground today. Let's try to sum up the key takeaways. We've seen international law is this fascinating beast lacking traditional enforcement, yet surprisingly effective due to self-interest, reciprocity, and a desire for order.
Right. We traced its roots, looked at the core sources like treaties and custom, and how they link to different philosophies like natural and positive law.
And we really highlighted that huge shift from state-only international law towards a broader world law encompassing individuals, human rights, and global justice concerns.
Which is perfectly illustrated by the evolution of the laws of war into international humanitarian law, with concepts like war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the push for individual accountability via tribunals and the ICC.
But we also acknowledge the ongoing debates and deep controversies, especially around the ICC's legitimacy, effectiveness, and that fundamental tension between national sovereignty and global justice.
Absolutely. And perhaps a final thought to leave you with connects right back to that core tension.
Go ahead.
Given this inherent conflict between the traditional idea of state sovereignty and this evolving push for global justice and accountability, how can international law possibly adapt, or maybe, how will it struggle to deal with future challenges? Think about new forms of conflict, cyber warfare, climate change refugees, human rights violations by powerful states who remain outside frameworks like the ICC. It's not a settled system. It's constantly being negotiated and challenged.
That really is the crucial question moving forward, isn't it? How does this system cope in a world full of both cooperation and intense competition, especially when key players don't fully buy in? We hope this deep dive has given you, our listener, a much richer understanding of this vital, complex, and often paradoxical field. What does it all mean for you? Thinking about these dynamics, sovereignty versus justice, law versus power, can really shape how you view global events unfolding right now.